Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Clara.
and Carolina, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on sleep and memory, how sleep affects the memories that are created during our waking state.
Interesting. So, how does sleep affect our memories?
Okay, so first I have to say that sleep is a state of heightened vulnerability since we're offline and not aware of our surroundings. And so, a really interesting question is, why does every animal sleep and why do we sleep for so long?
Yeah.
And one of the main proposed roles of sleep is a state in which we can consolidate our memories. And so it is thought that during sleep, memory traces that are created during the day can be strengthened, and also the networks are reorganized in a way that enables the formation of new connections, new associations and ideas,
Yes.
and the extraction of generalized features.
As well as inference and insight, as well as problem solving.
Yes, exactly. And so one thing that occurs is the reactivation of neuronal spatial temporal patterns
Okay.
that is thought to reinforce memory traces and stabilize them, as well as the coordination of activity between the hippocampus, which is considered to be the seat of the anatomical seat of memory in the brain, and the neocortex. And that enables memories to be essentially transferred for long-term storage.
Okay.
However, it's highly debated and controversial how this occurs, especially because there's also different forms of sleep. So there's rapid eye movement REM sleep, which is a lighter sleep state, and then there's non-rapid eye movement NREM or non-REM slow wave sleep, which is deep sleep basically. And during these different states, it is thought that different processes can happen.
Yeah.
And so it's confusing to differentiate what occurs when.
Can I say one thing?
Yes, of course.
So, yeah, I believe that enhanced cognitive performance has been linked with offline activity during both NREM and REM type of sleep. But from what I've read, it shows that they have a unique neurophysiological process that impacts cognition, perhaps in a way that doesn't occur when we're online.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
An interesting, somewhat counterintuitive thing that occurs during sleep is that there's actually global downscaling of connections. So just for some background, memories are, this is something else that is very controversial, but memories are thought to be stored in the strength of connections in neural circuits. So when a memory is formed, essentially the connections between specific neurons are strengthened, and then this memory can be replayed and is more likely to be replayed by the same circuit being activated.
Interesting.
So during sleep, it's thought that this reactivation occurs and that can stabilize and strengthen memories. But then there's something called synaptic scaling, which is a homeostatic mechanism that involves the downscaling, or actually it can be both ways, but in the context of sleep, it's thought to be the downscaling of all synaptic connections
Okay.
by an equal proportionate amount of their existing strength.
Do we know why this happens?
So it is a homeostatic mechanism that is thought to make sure that the connections, when they're strengthened, when a memory is formed, this doesn't lead to hyperexcitation.
Ooh, okay.
And which would result in things like seizures. And
Could it result in hallucinations or no?
I suppose it could. I don't really know the neurophysiology and the hallucinations, but yeah, I think it could. So, interestingly, global synaptic downscaling then is thought to improve the capacity to encode new information. So during the day, when we form new memories, it is thought that when we sleep, the reason we sleep is so that we can sort of clear the brain out and make way for new memories to form and new information to be attained.
Okay. But it could also be to do with the existing memories like reconnecting them or like reformatting them, right? That could lead to inferences.
Yes, I think that definitely occurs, but the purpose of synaptic scaling is to clear out,
Okay.
to prevent this like hyperexcitable state of the brain.
Okay, yeah.
But another important point linked to this is that it is also thought to selectively weaken connections that are already weak. So basically, the connections that aren't important
or used as much.
Exactly. So this is the interesting thing about sleep, that connections that are strong already are further strengthened, but connections that are weaker are completely weakened even more.
It does sound like a cleanup mechanism.
Yeah. I was going to say that again, and then I was thinking I already said this so many times. So, for example, really good neuroscientific evidence for this comes from a study that was done in 2017 that showed that at the level of the synapse, there was actually a decrease in the area of contact between the presynaptic terminal and the postsynaptic terminal during sleep compared to during wake. And this suggests then downscaling of the synaptic strength during sleep, because the synaptic strength is correlated usually to the size of it, structure function.
Yes.
And the shrinkage of this contact was only observed in the synapses that were already smaller to start with. So then this is evidence for weakening of already weak connections.
Nice. Yeah. I was gonna ask how they measured the volume, but it makes sense that they meant that they looked at the strength of the side.
The size of it was used to infer the strength of it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, on the other hand, other studies have shown that already formed memories are reactivated. For example, they found that neurons that were selectively responsive to a visual cue during the waking state, when they recorded the same population during sleep, these were the same ones that were showing activity during sleep. So this is essentially like a replay of what you're visually experiencing during a wake state. You're then replaying it during sleep.
Nice.
Yeah. And also, not only in terms of visual information, but it's been shown that during sleep there's coordinated activation of both the hippocampus, which, as I said, is responsible for memory, and the amygdala, which is this tiny structure that is responsible for emotion.
Such as fear and pleasure and, yeah.
Exactly. So this suggests that any like emotional associations we learn during the awake state are reinforced during sleep.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So could a lack of sleep then lead to less of like an emotional coupling to a specific memory?
I think it could. I think it's also debated whether or not emotion is within a memory or if it's associated with a memory, you know?
Yeah.
If emotion is part of the memory, then we could think of it in the sense that it's just replaying the memory, just the emotional part of the memory.
Oh, okay, not the memory itself,
or,
just the emotions.
Well, it's enforcing the emotional aspect of the memory.
Okay, interesting.
But depending on whether or not emotion is part of memory or associated alongside memory, then having no sleep could either decrease the emotional association or just the memory itself.
Yeah.
You get what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And useful.
You're like, how do I overcome my trauma?
Yeah, how do I implement this?
Oh, speaking of, a really cool study actually induced memories in mice. So they used a technique to stimulate brain activity during sleep in mice in order to artificially induce a reward association.
Okay.
So they were studying specific cells called place cells, which their activity encodes a specific location in space. And they recorded the activity of these place cells during the awake state in order to see which location they encode.
Yeah.
And then during sleep, they triggered rewarding stimulations when certain place cells, which they knew which location they encoded, were active. And so they stimulated a region known as the medial forebrain bundle,
Okay.
while specific place cells were active, all while the mouse was asleep,
Wow.
in a way that didn't wake up the mouse.
Okay.
Yeah, and then miraculously, but also logically, which is like neuroscience.
Science. Yeah.
Yeah. When the mouse woke up, they found that the mice spent longer in the location of this specific place cell that they chose to activate at the same time as the medial forebrain bundle activation.
This is like so manipulative.
Exactly, right? So it's like, wow, the potential for inducing new memories during sleep.
Yeah.
It always reminds me of the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Have you ever seen it?
No.
If any of our listeners have seen this movie, it's one of my favorite movies. It's so cool. It's like imagining a world in which memory erasure is possible.
Okay.
Yeah.
I find something interesting that I'd like to point out. Maybe it sounds a bit redundant, but when you think of memories, there's this spatial temporal aspect of it. You can be in the same space but at a different time, and like, how does the brain know that it's a different time and not get confused about it?
That's so true, because when we sleep, we have a sense of time. Do we have a sense of time?
I'm not sure.
We actually retain space and time
During sleep, don't you think time is a bit warped?
Time is definitely warped, but as in space is also like retained, but it's imaginary, so it's not really like, it's not physical space. It's like it's all like a replay of space, obviously. Oh my gosh.
But wait,
what?
Wait, before we get into that, I just wanted to point out that so there's the spatial temporal aspect of a memory, so remembering what I did last week in the same location.
Yes.
But on top of that, there's then the emotional aspect of it that you associate with a memory. So it's like there's this like y and I don't know, I see it as a y and an x axis scale of like time and space, and then like maybe there's like a third plane, which is the emotion.
Yeah.
And
so the z-axis, this aspect may be reorganization and new connections being formed rather than like the replay of old.
Potentially. I just think it's interesting what would happen if you like decouple them, and whether or not it's possible to decouple them. I guess
Oh yeah. So something else I wanted to talk about is rhythmic activity during sleep.
Yeah.
So brain waves are waves that are measured from electroencephalogram, and they are indicative of population activity throughout the brain. And it's used a lot to study sleep, because sleep is quite an inaccessible state, but this isn't a way to easily access brain activity because it can be recorded from outside the head. And one thing that was found is, so during non-REM sleep, in the cortex, slow oscillations occur, and this is coupled with something known as sleep spindles, which is, rather than being slow, low-frequency oscillations, they're high-frequency bursts. So the slow oscillations mainly occur in the cortex, and then the spindles occur mainly in the hippocampus, and it's like a form of coupling, which we actually mentioned in a previous episode on breathing, because I mentioned that breathing rate is thought to couple with the rate of both of these different waves, and therefore assist or underlie the communication between the hippocampus and the cortex, and therefore the movement of memories into long-term storage, which was another interesting point.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's slow oscillations and sleep spindles, and then there's delta waves, which are slightly smaller than slow oscillations and also more local. But as they're quite difficult to differentiate from the slow oscillations on the recordings, they're usually just classed under the same class.
Okay.
But really interestingly, a study actually tried to differentiate these two waves, and they found that there are competing roles for the slow oscillations and the delta oscillations during memory consolidation versus forgetting. So essentially, one underlies consolidation of memories and the other underlies forgetting of memories, all during sleep. So it's like this balance between remembering and forgetting, and like I was speaking about earlier with the synaptic scaling, there's always like a strengthening but also a weakening that's generally like a clear out of the whole brain.
So interesting. That definitely has parallels with the previous episode on breathing, where you also talked about how it's every time we take a breath and every time we exhale, that it's both increasing and decreasing.
Yes, it's all cyclical.
Yeah.
Rather than one or the other, it's like two are always happening at the same time. It's all a balance as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, maybe breathing actually underlies this
Oh my
balance of
God.
memory and forgetting.
There's got to be some like relationship between the two that
Yeah, we need to
we
study
need to
people
tap
who
in.
snore and don't breathe
Oh my
well
God.
during their sleep. But I just wanted to quickly, more specifically, explain what they found in the
Yeah.
study. So they either silenced delta waves or the slow oscillations during sleep.
And what did this show?
So, sorry. First, they measured the activity of slow oscillations, delta waves, and sleep spindles. And they found that the rate at which the sleep spindles, so the bursts of activity, synchronizes with slow oscillations versus delta waves is different. And the best predictor of how well these animals, because they were doing the studies in rats, remembered a new skill after sleep was the rate at which the spindles synchronized with the slow oscillations relative to the delta waves. It's like a third level of complexity.
Wow.
So essentially the spindles lock to the different parts of the different oscillations, slow and delta. And then
I feel like this is like an abstract painting. I'm just trying to imagine all of the different oscillations and
Yeah.
like couplings.
Yeah, I'm doing the same thing as I'm trying to explain it. So the slow oscillations and delta waves kind of compete to align with the spindles, which cognitively we can think of this as like remembering and forgetting and remembering and forgetting, and they're competing. But then you need to have like just the right balance so that the spindles lock to the slow oscillations relative to the delta waves, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And an interesting point is that there's actually an increased prevalence. Okay, so the slow oscillations are thought to underlie remembering, whereas delta is thought to underlie forgetting.
Okay.
But you need both.
Yeah.
And this is a bit unrelated, but potentially very related, is that in dementia and in aging in general, there's actually an increased prevalence of delta waves.
Okay.
And so perhaps as we age, there is more forgetting happening during sleep. And this contributes to the memory loss. And because of the higher prevalence of delta, the sleep spindles are more likely to couple with the delta rather than the slow oscillations. And so, yeah, there's less memory, more forgetting. And, yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And they only were able to find this from actually differentiating slow oscillations from delta waves, which is not routinely done. So implications for future research.
I wonder how it translates onto the molecular level.
Yes. Well, the fact that the delta waves underlie the forgetting process, it may have something to do with the synaptic downscaling, the synaptic scaling homeostasis mechanism. Whereas the slow waves are more global. So, and this is all really speculative. Wow. Slow waves may help to reinforce that reactivation that strengthens existing memory traces.
Yeah.
And definitely, I would be interested to see how. I'm really interested as to how like brainwaves can be explained at the cellular or synaptic level. Because I think there's like this sort of divide with studying things at the cellular level and at the brainwave level.
Yeah. Going a little bit beyond just memory consolidation and formation, I read this interesting paper about how sleep can facilitate inference from learned knowledge. So the author is Kareem Choku, and this was, I think, in 2021. Yeah. And so basically they had this experiment with mice in which they had like 4 different scenarios, A, B, C, D, E, 5. And basically like A had more, like in this maze had like more sucrose than B had more than C had more than D had more than E. And so like given the choice between like A and B, A is more favorable.
Yeah.
Okay. And so they did a bunch of like learning about which had more sugar and which had less, what were the patterns between, like I just said, A versus B and A and C, they're like similar. It showed that when the mice were sleep deprived, they couldn't make any inferences about the learned data, about the memories, whereas if mice had gone through the REM sleep stage, it was able to then show that they could make inferences between the patterns of the different cages. So like which were the two most unfavorable scenarios and which were the two most favorable, or like which had like, like this thing in common versus not.
So maybe sleep provides the opportunity to make a framework for how future information will then fit in with that framework.
Potentially. So then they looked at the circuitry responsible for this, and they showed that the anterior cingulate cortex, there's crosstalk with the MEC, which is the medial entorhinal cortex, and this only happens during enough REM sleep, and that without this connection, it can't make any inferences, and this was then showed when they artificially activated this connection.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating.
Fitting with your interest in the medial entorhinal cortex.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is upstream of the hippocampus.
Exactly.
Where memories are thought to be primarily stored.
Mm-hmm. So during sleep, several related memories can be connected to construct a knowledge structure. And this allows for information to be inferred, and this capacity is not present online after learning. It's only present after offline post-learning. It doesn't really appear immediately after you've learned the task. You need to go through a sleep period. Which
I definitely, well, first of all, imagining myself sleep deprived, I also wouldn't know or care which room has the most sugar. I wouldn't be able to infer that easily.
Yes.
And I also definitely, as we all probably do, have experienced like having the weirdest associations occur during my sleep. Like I'll wake up from a dream and be like, why was that and that in the same
context
thing? Yeah. In the same space and time.
So yeah, I think it's interesting how sleep is necessary for like memory formation and consolidation, as well as the fact that then that is a platform in order to then build on this scaffolding structure of like all of these related memories and connect them together, and I guess that's how knowledge then arises. Yeah.
Another thing to mention is, as I mainly talked about non-REM sleep and its role in synaptic downscaling, but contrastingly, in REM sleep, there's found to be a neurochemical composition that's more favoring plasticity. So during REM sleep, there's higher levels of acetylcholine, which functions in strengthening synapses, and there's also been found to be local upregulation of plasticity related genes. So this may support local synaptic consolidation and also like maybe forming new connections that were just primed during our awake state, but then in sleep it's like, oh, let's test if this has actually strengthened. So on that note, we hope that you enjoyed today's episode, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on how important you think sleep is for memory.
And if you notice that you form newer interesting connections once you've had a good night's sleep.